Hello and welcome to EE 447. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we're going to take another look at our HTML tables and how to work on selective styling. And we're going to look at two different ways to go about doing this. For this particular example, a couple of things is number one, I'm going to be using the CSS selectors reference from W3 Schools. I'm also going to be using the Wikipedia article on the presidents of the United States because we need some content. And then lastly, what we're going to be doing is we are going to build an HTML table utilizing the content from the presidents of the United States. And the idea is that the table, the alternating rows in the table will have different colors. So you can have as much fun with this as you want to. We're going to focus on alternating rows, but I'm going to do it two different ways so that you can see that you can control the behavior using not only the class attribute, but also CSS selectors. And so to begin with, I'm going to go ahead and create a new file, HTML file. And then before we forget, let's go ahead and save it. And I want to go ahead and save this one as my HTML table 05. Now it's not a direct, it's not going to be a direct descendant from those, just trying to keep a sequential order in our examples. So we're going to call this example underscore table underscore 05. So let's go ahead and build just the bare table. We're not going to worry too much yet about the style. All I want to do is focus just on the structure and the content. And so if you recall, we need the table tag. We also need the head. And within the head is going to be a single row that will have two columns in there. Okay. And what we'll do is we're just going to focus on, let's say, two pieces of information. We're going to focus on the name of the president and then the party that they were affiliated with. It doesn't really matter what the second piece of information is. It's more that we want to be able to control the coloration, create basically a more aesthetically pleasing table. So what we're going to do is for the first header, we're going to just call this one, the president. And then the second one is going to be the party. And before I forget, why don't we go ahead and put in here in the body that using a comment here, that the source for this article is actually going to be the Wikipedia page. And we can also go so far as to actually put that as a P tag with an A tag in the body. So say href equal to, and what we'll do is we will keep the title that Wikipedia uses, and that is just simply the list of presidents of the United States. And if you've not yet looked at any of the list of pages in Wikipedia, they are a great resource for these types of projects. Okay, so we have our head established now, and we've also got a hyperlink in there. We want to maybe take a look at what our table itself, the aesthetics of the table itself, not just the rows, are going to be, but we're not going to worry about that right now. Instead, what we want to do is we want to focus on the body. And since we have two columns, each one of our TRs or rows must have two TD elements in them. Now, as I've mentioned in other videos, the spaces are for the humans. HTML ignores these spaces, or rather the web browser ignores these spaces. So whether you decide to do the tags on a separate line doesn't really matter in many cases. So I would encourage you for conciseness to go ahead and keep the TH and the TVs on a single line unless you have multiple elements such as hyperlinks or paragraphs inside of them, unless you have nested elements. But what we're going to do is we're just going to start off, we're just going to keep 3 rows. We're going to start with 3 rows. Okay, and then we're going to expand this a little bit further in just a minute. So for the first row of our body, the first president, oh, no, it was not me, sorry about that, George Washington. That was a little Freudian right there, sorry about that. Let's try that again. George Washington, and he was actually not affiliated with any party. The second president of the United States was John Adams, and he was what was referred to as a Federalist. And Thomas Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. And we can, of course, do the same thing that Wikipedia has done, and then we can hyperlink a lot of these. That's not really the goal in this one. We're just, once again, we're trying to work on the aesthetics of our table and coming up with an automated way to do that using styles. And like I said, what we can do is we can continue on with this. I tell you what, why don't we go ahead and get a 4th one in here just so that we can verify our behavior, because that's the whole goal. So we want to have 2 columns for each row, and that means that we're going to include James Madison. And he was also a Democratic Republican. Okay. All right, so that should be enough data for us. So the first thing we want to do is we are actually going to make a duplicate copy of this table. And probably not a bad thing to do would be to come along and leverage that additional tag that we seldom use with tables, or at least you won't use them all the time. And that is to go ahead and use the caption. So this first one is going to essentially be a hard-coded class name. And the second one, or the second table, let's go ahead and caption this one using CSS selectors. You can improve on those caption names as you'd like. Okay, so let's go to the first table. We're going to work on the style as we go along for the head and for the body separate. For right now, what we're going to do is we're going to focus simply on the rows themselves, and particularly the column elements of the rows. And so the idea here is that I want to change the color of the alternating rows based on whether the row is even or odd. Okay, so to begin with, we can see how or where we would like to place this by just playing around with the style property of the head row. And what we'll do here is we'll set up just set the background color of the head row. Once again, let's just play around. And so we're going to set this to aqua, and you can see that I can affect the color of a row either through the individual columns or the row itself. Okay, and as we talked about before when we were dealing with styles and sort of aggregating them to one location, we could go through and on each row, we could style them separately, but that would mean then every time we wanted to make a change, we'd have to go back and change and make sure we changed it correctly in every location. Not very efficient. So rather than going through and affecting the style on each one of the rows individually, what we want to do is we're going to leave the head row alone, and what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the body rows, and we're going to use a class attribute, and we're going to keep it pretty simple. The first row is just going to be identified as an odd row. The second row is going to be identified as an even row. Third row, once again, as an odd row, and fourth row is going to be an even row. Now, before we go too much further in this, your first thought should be, this is terrible. And the reason why your first thought should be that is because if I gave you a table with 1,000 rows, it would take you half an hour or longer just simply to do this. And so the idea here is we're seeing the process, but more than likely, you're going to be building a program that will export HTML, and you would be handling this in code by using some sort of modulus or division function. Okay, so don't worry about how you would handle this. This does not scale well, this approach. Manually manipulating the class names on a few rows is fine, but that doesn't scale very well. This would definitely be the result of an automated process. Okay, but the key is that our first row is odd, and then the second row even, and so on. Okay, so now what that does is that allows for us to come up here into the head and go ahead and create a style associated with the TR tags. Okay, and so what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the first one. We're going to call this one tr.odd and use that class name selector for the rows. And then here what we can do is now we can specify that the background color, we can make this, let's try to see how lively we can make this. How about crimson? And then what we can do then is we can either make the other rows some other color, or we can specify through another selector the even and background color. How about I believe there is a dark pink, dark salmon. That should probably look fairly decent. And then from there, then you can see that every other row is going to be an alternate color. Now, while we're at it, we probably want to go ahead and handle the head, the row in the head. You can do that a couple of different ways. We could create a separate style just for the untagged, the unclassed TR tags. And then that would sort of become the default for anything that doesn't have a class associated, which means that effectively every row in the second table is going to be affected. And just to see what I'm talking about here, I'm going to go ahead and set this to something. How about if we do yellow? You're probably wondering if I'm intentionally picking garish colors, and you are correct, because that will hopefully encourage you to explore and pick out some better ones. But as you can see, as I have affected both the tables, whereas all I was intending on doing is affecting the top one. Now I've got a couple of ways, like I said, that I can solve that. The only way that I would discourage you from doing it is by doing it in line. So in other words, try to avoid mixing in line with sort of this aggregated one at top. The whole benefit of aggregating it up top is that if you wanted to push it out to a separate file, you knew where all your style was. And so probably one of the better thing to do is to come along down here with this particular row, is to either identify it using an ID or another class. And so maybe, for instance, what you'd like to do is specify this as the TR head, okay? And you can even leave that portion off, the TR. And so now what I will do is I will limit my yellow color to only the TRs that have the class head, which does mean that down here in the second table, you could actually also make that yellow. Now, just a reminder, there are a few other style aspects that we may want to handle. And that is affiliated now with the table itself. And we want to style both of these tables the same way for this particular example. So for instance, you may choose the border collapse like we did in the prior example. And then also what you can do is you can specify the border itself, and you can specify, for instance, a ridged border. But then you also have to remember that you have to specify the border for the cells as well. So what you would want to do there is for both the TH and the TD, we would go ahead and specify the border. And so you could actually go ahead and aggregate all those three together as well. So but if you save that, then this is getting closer to kind of what we expect, or what is convention for a lot of tables that you've probably seen on various web pages. You can also go back to the TD and TH, and you can do things like affect the padding or the amount of space that surrounds the text. So we'll just put a value in there, 8 pixels, and basically what this does, it increases the white space around all of the text. You can also look at the text alignment property. And for instance, if we wanted to center all of them, all right, so now we get the consistent behavior like you would expect to see in the head. So the head and now the body is the same. And if you notice what I'm doing here, everything I'm doing in this particular portion of the style is affecting both tables. So part of my style is essentially being selective through the class, and then part of it is affecting all the elements. And you can also do something like that by choosing another selector. So we're going to take this one out for just a second. And what you can do is you can also use selectors like the star selector, and certain things will be available to it. So for instance, if you wanted to make every elements, every text element have the same alignment, you could do that as well. So this is now going to be universal over the whole document, unless you are more specific then later on. And so let's say, for instance, that I would want, wouldn't know why I'd want to do it, but let's say I would like to have the even tags have a left justification, or rather the even classed rows have a left justification. Okay. So you have the ability to control the selection process multiple different ways, including the class and the ID. So we're going to return the text align down here now to the TD and TH. And by the way, I would like to redo that real quick. I had that text align in the wrong spot. I accidentally put it in the rows here. So what we're going to do is we're going to force the text align for all of the elements, and then down here in the TH and TD, we're going to force it back to left to see the behavior. And so you can see that essentially what's happening is it's overriding it because it's more specific. So the star, if you use the star selector to select all elements, then what you can do is you can later on override that behavior unless it's deemed unoverridable. Okay. So we'll take this back out. You'll see that then everything is centered. So for this example, I'm just going to go ahead and leave it the way it is, because now what I'd like to do is I'd like to focus on how can we make the alternating rows happen in the second table. All right. So for the head row, I'm going to go ahead and use the same class so that that way it has the same behavior, because I don't really not really trying to change that any. Instead, what I would like to do now is I would like to use a different selector method called the nth child. And the nth child can be applied to a row. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to apply it to the even rows, and then we're going to apply a different one to the odd rows. And we're going to see if we can find some garish colors, or we'll see what we can come up with here. But what we want to do here is up here now in our style, we're going to create one more selector. And so using the TR tag, we want to specify the nth child, and we want to specify even. And for the background color, we're going to do this just a little bit different in that I'm actually going to use the pound sign here. And this will allow for us then to pick using this color map. And from there, you can have some fun with it. So let's see here. What's probably the worst combination of colors we can come up with? How about that green? It seems reasonable. And then if we update this, then actually let's leave this. I think we've got a specified even here. What has happened? Give me just a second. So what is happening here is that Visual Studio is not recognizing that selector with respect to its design view. And so if you save it and you go back out to your web browser one more time, open your example table 05, you'll see that we have now updated every other row. However, we also managed to update every other row in the first table. So to see what I'm talking about, if you come along here and you take this out real quick, save it again, you'll see that our first table returns back to the red and dark salmon that we were using, and the second table has no row color associated with it. We put that back in, and now if we save it and go out and refresh, we'll see that the green is now being applied to the even rows of both tables. So how can we fix that? Well, it turns out that not only does the selectors, can you override certain selectors, the order in which you do things matter. And so what you can simply do to fix this problem is move that element of styling up above the other elements of styling associated with the TR. So in other words, have that be applied first, and then it'll be overridden later. Then when you save it and you go refresh it, you'll see that our table, our first table, where we have explicitly stated the class attribute, the style associated with that class is going to override any generic TR tag. And then The last thing that we want to do is figure out how to handle the odd. Well, the odd is going to be just the same approach as the even was. You could handle that through a default application on all rows if you wanted to first, in which case then you could simply just say above the tr nth child, you would just pick a default color. But let's just apply this one more time here. In this particular case now, we're going to we'll let it stay with this real quick. And then I'll pick a different background color. Once again, using our color picker. Let's see if we can find something in the light green range. Let's try that real quick. Once again, you're not going to see any change in Visual Studio, but you are going to go out here and you now see the alternate rows. A couple of different ways to go about doing this. Once again, you can hard code the class. You can leverage this nth child selector. You've actually seen now several selectors. You've seen the class selector, ID selector, tags, the star, and now this function, as well as one from an earlier video, the before and after. Once again, I encourage you to take a look at this table right here, this CSS selectors table. Should give you a lot of ideas. Probably one that would also be useful is maybe this last child. It's a nice way of ending a table, perhaps. So hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions or suggestions, don't hesitate to let me know. And thank you for watching.